Ready for a deep dive? We've got these lecture notes. Filsafat Hukum Sesi 1 Prodi, S1 FHUMT, Dr. Suyud M.pdf.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, they're from an Indonesian university course on, get this, the philosophy of law.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Right, and even just skimming through, I was hooked. So this Sesi 1 focuses on the philosophy of knowledge, which seems kind of, I don't know.
A little heady.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
how's that relate to actual laws?
Well, it's actually crucial.
Oh.
Yeah, because it's not just about the laws themselves, it's the why behind them, the foundation. It's like, why those rules and not others?
Okay, so like before you can even have a legal system, you have to figure out what you even mean by right and wrong.
Exactly. And this text jumps right into that with Filsafat Ilmu, the philosophy of science.
Which is what now?
Sorry, philosophy of science. It might seem like a leap, but it's really connected.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about it. At its core, a legal system, it's about figuring out the truth, right?
I mean, I guess so.
Just like science. Evidence, logic, separating fact from fiction. These are crucial in both.
So it's like, even if we're talking about different things, the way we get to the truth, the methods, those have to be solid no matter what.
Exactly. And just like, say, a scientific breakthrough leads to new tech, new possibilities.
Yeah.
Understanding the philosophy behind law, that can lead to a society that's truly just.
Whoa, okay, I see where you're going with this. So this text, it talks about scientific concepts and scientific statements. Anything in there particularly jump out at you in terms of how, like, law actually works?
There was. One thing that's so interesting is how much legal systems borrow from scientific thinking. Like, take causation. Proving that someone's actions directly led to something happening.
Oh, right. Like if you're trying to prove someone's guilty of something, you have to show it was actually their fault.
Exactly. And that requires evidence, logic, not just saying, well, it feels like they did it.
It's got to be provable, right? Not just a hunch.
Precisely. And this text, it emphasizes the real-world impact of knowledge, its existence, and application. And in law, well, that's where things get fascinating.
Because it's not just theories in a book. It's like, what happens when these ideas actually get put into practice in courtrooms?
Think about it, DNA evidence. That completely revolutionized forensics. That's a perfect example of how new knowledge can completely reshape legal processes.
And probably change the outcome of a lot of cases.
Absolutely. It's about the power of connecting those abstract ideas to the real world, to people's lives.
It's like, yeah, one discovery can change so much. And this text, it talks about how knowledge, it impacts methods and like even models of how we do things.
Right, and it even changes society itself. Right, it's not a static thing.
Yeah, totally. And that made me think about how laws changed over time. It's not like, oh, this is the law and it's always been this way. Like the text mentioned technology and scientific methods to validate information. And that's changed so much about what even counts as evidence.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Think about how court cases happen now versus like hundreds of years ago. It's a completely different ballgame.
We're past those witch trials with the, like, drown them and see if they float kind of thing.
Thankfully.
Right.
But yeah, we're much more reliant on things that can be objectively verified.
Which makes sense. But, okay, beyond even the tools, this text went into logic, like specifically deductive and inductive reasoning. And I don't know, that feels kind of huge for how legal systems work, right?
It's huge EE because different schools of thought within law, they really argue about the role of logic in making a just system. It's not just about being logical. It's like whose logic wins out.
Oh, interesting. Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, totally.
Cool.
So take natural law theory, the idea that there are like inherent moral principles, right? That we're all born with some sense of what's right and wrong.
Okay, I've heard of that.
So they say, our laws should reflect that, right? And that uses a lot of deductive reasoning. It's like, life is sacred, therefore taking a life is wrong, so we have laws against murder, taking a big general principle and applying it to a specific case.
Right, like that top-down logic. But wait, then how does inductive reasoning fit into law? Because that feels way more like, I don't know, observing things, looking at probabilities.
Exactly. And that's where things get more, well, more complex. Think about legal realism, which is this idea that, okay, yeah, we have laws on the books, but how they actually get used, that's a whole other thing.
Because judges are human, right? They have their own experiences, their own maybe biases even.
Exactly. So a legal realist would look at a case and be like, okay, the law says this, but based on the evidence, the context, even just knowing how this judge tends to rule, they're looking for the likely outcome based on patterns, not just some pure logic.
So it's almost like inductive reasoning in law. It acknowledges that messy human element. It's not just A plus B equals C.
And that's what I think is so cool about this text. It's academic, yeah, but it hits at this tension. You can have a totally logical argument for a law, but if it completely ignores how people actually behave, how society really works, is it truly a just law?
Whoa, yeah, that's kind of a mind-blowing question.
Right. And it makes you think differently about how we design legal systems, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And, it makes me think about something else this text mentioned, the difference between scientific concepts and scientific statements. Does that come up in law, too?
All the time. Because a concept, like let's say causation, again, that can be used in tons of fields, right? But a statement, that's usually the result of some experiment. It's got data. It's super specific.
So you can't just be like, well, this study about, I don't know, eyewitness testimony proves my client's innocent.
Exactly. And this is where legal philosophy gets really interesting. How much weight should scientific findings have? Are there times when human judgment, even with all its flaws, is still necessary? There's no easy answer.
Wow, this is making me appreciate the job of lawyers and judges even more, honestly. It's like they're constantly balancing all these different ways of knowing things.
Right. And the stakes are so high. Someone's freedom, their reputation, their life even, can depend on how these ideas are used.
It's really fascinating how much depth there is to these ideas. And honestly, reading this text, there was a moment where I thought, wait, are we going all the way back to ancient Greece now?
Yeah.
Because they mentioned Pythagoras.
They did, didn't they?
Yeah. And it felt kind of random. I don't know.
It's a subtle thing, but it's there for a reason. That little nod to Pythagoras, where the word philosophy comes from, it's a reminder that these big questions about knowledge, about truth, we've been wrestling with them for ages.
So like even today, we're still having the same arguments in a way that philosophers were having centuries ago.
Exactly. And legal systems, they're grappling with the same dilemmas. What is U.S. justice? How do we know what's right? Those aren't new questions.
It's like this really long-running conversation that we're all a part of in a way. But what I thought was cool was how this text laid out the methods of philosophy, like questioning, debating. They even called it dialectic, which, I'll be honest, I had to look that one up.
It sounds fancy, but it's really not that complicated.
Right. Just like a back and forth trying to get to the truth by looking at all sides.
And that's what good lawyering is, isn't it? Presenting your case, but also poking holes in the other side's argument. That's how we get closer to a just outcome, even if perfect truth is, like, impossible to find.
So even with all the rules, all the procedures, there's still that element of philosophy happening right there in the courtroom.
Absolutely. And they mentioned systematic presentation, too, which might sound boring.
Yeah, like who wants to be systematic?
Right. But think about it. You can have amazing arguments, rock-solid evidence, but if you can't present it clearly, persuade people. Well, juries are still human. They can get swayed by a good story, even if it's not the whole truth.
It's like it's not just about the facts of a case. It's how those facts are presented, how they're woven into a narrative.
And that's what I find so fascinating about legal philosophy. It bridges that gap between the ideal, like what should justice look like in a perfect world, and the messy reality of how humans actually make those judgments.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we're not perfect, even with our laws and our courts. So as we're wrapping up here, is there anything from this deep dive, anything you really hope sticks with our listener?
If I had to pick one thing, it's this. Don't take laws at face value. They're not neutral. They didn't just appear out of thin air. Behind every rule, every verdict, there's a whole web of philosophical assumptions about knowledge, about ethics, even about human nature itself.
So it's like an invitation to think critically, not just accept what the law says, but to always be asking, why is it this way?
Exactly. Because if we want a more just world, we can't shy away from those big questions.
And on that note, it's time for us to come up for air from this deep dive. But before we go, we want to leave you with something to ponder. Think about a legal case, maybe one you followed in the news, or even a fictional one from a movie or book that stuck with you. Now ask yourself, what are the philosophical ideas underneath? What assumptions are being made about truth, fairness, even the purpose of having laws in the first place?
It's something to chew on because it reminds us that law isn't just this abstract thing. It's woven into all our lives, whether we realize it or not.
And understanding its philosophical roots, well, that can help us make sense of the world, make better choices, maybe even push for change where it's needed.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep asking those big questions.